More than with most other people, yesterday is reflected in today. History is as fresh as the morning news. The Scots-Irish story begins in the Scottish lowlands, from where in the early 17th century they began to emigrate in large numbers to the north of Ireland. From the Scottish borders came one of the most important components of the Scots-Irish, the riding families. Armstrongs, Johnstons, Bells, Grahams, violent outlaws who lived by raiding across the border into England. In the high moorlands of Liddesdale is Hermitage Castle, guardhouse of the bloodiest valley in Britain, according to a border historian. It was from strongholds like this that the better-off border thieves could defy the power of governments, Scots or English. Smailholm is one of the many peel towers which dot the border country. It belonged to the Pringles, one of the most notorious of the feuding clans of the eastern borders. George MacDonald Fraser has written a history of these border families.
In the great wars between England and Scotland, Edward I and Robert the Bruce and Wallace, this countryside took a terrible beating. For generations almost, it was impossible to live normally, to farm peacefully, and the people who lived here, both in England and in Scotland, took to robbery for a living. In fact, what they did was systematic gangsterism. They lived by cattle stealing, by kidnapping, by holding to ransom, and by the protection racket which they invented and which they called by a name which has passed into the language, blackmail. And this went on even when the wars between England and Scotland were over. The people had got into the way of living by plunder, and they ran raids from England into Scotland, from Scotland into England. Sometimes the men from the two sides of the borders would combine, and they became known as the border reivers. Reiver meaning a robber, a cattle rustler. And at the same time, through this life of crime, because that's what it was, they became extremely skillful guerrilla fighters, scouts, frontiersmen. When the war broke out again, as sometimes it did, you would find that the people from this countryside became the scouts and light horsemen for the English or Scottish armies. It was only when James I came to the throne that the border was pacified. Until that time, they lived in towers like this one, which are very strong places, well fortified, and in time of trouble they would get their cattle inside and defend themselves against all comers. James was determined to put a stop to this, and he had the borders pacified in a very rough fashion. An awful lot of people were killed, Others were sent to the Low Countries, where they served as mercenaries. But most of them, whole tribes, whole families, were shipped to Northern Ireland. James I's idea was that they would settle down peacefully as farmers. But being what they were, which was very skillful guerrilla fighters and robbers by nature, they formed a very hard core. You can say that they were probably the best frontier fighters in Britain, possibly in Europe. And these were the people who were the sort of center, if you like, of the Scotch-Irish settlers in Ulster and, of course, later in the United States.